What is up, guys? Hope you guys had a great Valentine's Day. Here in China, you got some people gifting Nio ET5s to their girlfriends slash wives. Absolutely amazing. Yeah. So in this video, we're going to talk about some important stuff. Nio China listing that was supposed to happen. What is going on with that? Also some BASS stuff. So with battery rental, what happens if the battery gets damaged? And is there any distinction between a rented battery and a bought battery? So let's start off with that. We all know with BASS, battery rental, when you rent the battery, you're basically not just paying for the car, not for the battery, and you're renting the battery, you're paying monthly for the battery. There's actually no distinction between a rented battery and a bought battery. So I bought my Nio with BASS, I rented the battery, so that means I've rented a battery. And if you bought a car without BASS and just bought the straight up battery, what could happen is, say that person bought his Nio and bought the battery. He goes to a battery swap, that battery goes into the swap station, and then I go for a battery swap. That battery might end up on my car, right? So there's actually no distinction between a battery that's bought by someone and a battery that's rented by someone. It's more like I'm renting a battery and the other guy, he owns a battery. Okay? So there's kind of some interesting things that might happen in that situation. So what happens if you get your battery scratched or damaged, and who covers the cost? So this is quite interesting because this was something that popped up recently. So apparently, if you own a battery and you damaged the battery, you scratched the battery, then your insurance also covers the battery. Then it pays for the damage of the battery and repair costs and that kind of stuff. So whenever you go for a swap, they detect and scan everything, check everything, make sure it's okay. And if there's physical damage to the battery, then of course you can't really swap it. You're not supposed to swap it. So you're most likely going to be sent to the service center and they're going to check things up. And if it needs to be paid for, then your insurance has to pay for it. However, if you rented a battery, in your BASS payment, monthly BASS payment, there's an extra 60 RMB surcharge, which is roughly like $10 per month. That is the insurance for the battery. That's the insurance fee for the battery. So if I scratch the battery somehow, then the battery insurance covers that. Okay, the BASS insurance. So not my insurance. Very interesting. So actually saving me some money, okay? Because if you own the battery and you go through that battery repair cost, that kind of stuff, then your insurance is going to increase next year. Whereas with this situation, it's not going to increase next year because it's not really me handling the situation. So there's actually another selling point for BASS. And I guess the best way to describe buying a battery versus renting a battery, it's just like, for example, think of a huge building and there's rooms everywhere. For me, I have permission to live in one of those rooms, any one of those rooms, but I'm paying monthly, okay? Someone who's bought the battery is like a person that's bought one of those rooms, but he can live in any one of those rooms, okay? So that's the best way I can describe it. So I hope that makes it very clear. And then when it comes to battery degradation, this is very interesting. Battery degradation is maintained by Nio themselves. So if they detect that a battery has been suffering from battery degradation, then what they'll do is they'll take apart the battery and then swap out the bad cells with newer cells. So they're not going to dispose of the battery like completely. They're only replacing the cells that are bad and then making sure that the battery health is above 85%, right? 80 to 85% above that. And that's their sort of like their metric to make sure that every battery in the ecosystem is healthy. So in that sense, you really don't have to worry about battery degradation. Of course, Nio handles the cost of that, and the cost is very minimal, okay? But still, nonetheless, that is the cost that Nio has to bear. Very, very interesting. Yeah, and then there's also some distinction, especially in Europe, between like A-type batteries and C-type batteries, B-type batteries. Apparently, one type charges faster than the other type, so some people are hesitant to swap. That is actually a situation that's going on in Europe, and you know, that's just the way it is. And also here, like 70 and 75, the standard range. There's 70 kilowatt hours and 75 kilowatt hours. Sometimes you get the other one. Sometimes you get 70. Sometimes you get 75. If I get the 75, it's a little bit extra range, 25 kilometers extra range. So, I mean, it's not a huge deal, okay, in my personal opinion. But of course, some of the European Nio owners, they might be a little bit more concerned about charging speed, which I understand. And that sometimes does happen. You might get a slower charging battery than the one you had before, or you might get a faster charging battery. I think that's the better way to think about it. Be a bit more optimistic. Okay, so that's all the stuff we're going to talk about for the BASS stuff. Now, what about the Nio China listing? Now, back when Nio got bailed out in 2020, what happened was, of course, they they spun all the assets from Nio Inc. into Nio China, and then Nio Inc. owns a portion of Nio China, and the rest of Nio China is owned by the Anhui government. And one of the contingencies, one of the clauses is that in 4 or 5 years, like 2024, they're supposed to go public here in China, list Nio China. So that's a way for those investors, the government, to cash out essentially. So that's supposed to happen, but but it didn't happen. Nio China hasn't been listed. But what has been happening is that Nio Inc. has been slowly but surely purchasing back ownership of Nio China, to the extent that the original government shareholders have essentially already cashed out. All right, so there's no more need for Nio China to go public here in China, because the shareholders basically already cashed out. So Nio Inc., the thing that you're invested in Nio stock, is Nio Inc. basically. It doesn't own 100% of Nio China. Okay, let's make that very clear. So it's a very interesting situation. Also, the recent investment from Anhui government, because a few months ago we had that very interesting investment where the government kind of chased down Nio CEO, said they want to invest in Nio China. That's investing in Nio China and not in Nio Inc. Okay, so that just means that Nio China gets Nio Inc.'s ownership of Nio China gets diluted a little bit, and Nio China has more money. Okay, so I know it's very confusing, but that also sort of ensures that there's a lot of flexibility for them to get money, and without direct dilution to you guys. Of course, like that kind of funding does mean that there is a tiny bit of impact. Your ownership of Nio Inc. is not affected, but Nio Inc.'s ownership of Nio China is affected. And Nio China is essentially Nio, all right? So I know it's very confusing, but it seems like they're not going to go public with Nio China. It doesn't really make sense for them to go public anymore, unless they're going to do like more funding, right? Which is also very possible. So they might get other investors to invest into Nio China, and then they might list Nio China for a way for them to cash out, which is always a possibility. And I think that's also very reassuring for me, in the sense that I know for a fact that they're not going to go bankrupt, and I know for a fact that there's a lot of flexibility for them to get capital. So that's what I think. All right, that's my opinion. As always, stay safe, stay healthy. Peace out.